Chapter 12. Test Screenings. Referred Pain. Toward the end of the editing process on Julia, Fred Zinnemann observed that he felt the director and editor, alone with the film for months and months, could only go 90% of the way toward the finished film. That what was needed for the last 10% was the participation of the audience, whom he saw as his final collaborators. Not in the sense that he would respond to them blindly, but that he felt their presence was helpful as a corrective, to keep certain obsessions from becoming corrosive and to point out blind spots that may have developed through over-familiarity with the material. This has certainly been my experience. All of the films I have worked on have been tested before large audiences, except for The Conversation and Unbearable Lightness. We had screenings of them, of course, but we never had wide-open public screenings. Francis Coppola, in particular, has always been an enthusiastic supporter of screening his films almost at any stage, almost no matter how unfinished they were. Rough screenings would be for small groups of about 10 people whom he knew, mixed with 2 or 3 people who were strangers. The strangers would have no previous idea of what this film was about, and he would question them afterward on a one-to-one basis to compare their opinions to the reaction of the people who did know about the film. Fred Zinnemann, by contrast, would show Julia to a preview audience only when it was technically completely finished, with a cut negative and optical soundtrack. He was perfectly prepared to change it after that, but he doesn't believe that general audiences can completely discount visible splices, color mismatches, and incomplete soundtracks. And I agree with him. Even with technically finished films, public previews are tricky things. You can learn a tremendous amount from them, but you have to be cautious about direct interpretations of what people have to say to you, particularly on those cards they fill out after the screening. I'm extremely suspicious of those. The most helpful thing of all is simply learning how you feel when the film is being shown to 600 people who have never seen it before. Emotionally, it seems like some big hand has come and grabbed you by the hair, picked you up, and put you down 90 degrees to one side. And you think, oh God, look at that. It's as if up to this moment you have been constructing a building, but always standing in front of it to evaluate it. Now all of a sudden you are looking at the side of the building and seeing things you seem to have never seen before. You shouldn't blindly follow what you learn from these test screenings any more than you should anything else. What can you learn from the differences between the previous screening and this one? Given these 2 headings, where is the North Pole? Test screenings are just a way to find out where you are. There was one procedure on Julia that, unfortunately, I have never seen repeated. We had a person sitting at a table in the lobby of the preview theater with a sign in front of him that said, "If you want to talk to us on the telephone after a few days, leave your number here." And then those conversations were transcribed and added into the survey. If you are going to do previews and listen to what people have to say, that's the way to do it, after they have had a day or 2 to let the film sink in. Don't look at what people write in the heat of the moment. You get a reaction, but it's a skewed reaction. There's a lot of what is medically called referred pain in that process. When you go to a doctor and tell him that you have a pain in your elbow, it is the quack who takes out his scalpel and starts to operate on the elbow. Then you wind up with not only the original pain, but probably a pain in your wrist and your shoulder as well. Whereas an experienced doctor studies you, takes an X-ray, and determines that the cause of the pain is probably a pinched nerve up in your shoulder. You just happen to feel it in your elbow. The pain in the shoulder has been referred to the elbow. Audience reactions are like that. When you ask the direct question, "What was your least favorite scene?" and 80% of the people are in agreement about one scene they do not like, the impulse is to fix that scene or cut it out. But the chances are that that scene is fine. Instead, the problem may be that the audience simply didn't understand something that they needed to know for the scene to work. So instead of fixing the scene itself, you might clarify some exposition that happens 5 minutes earlier. Don't necessarily operate on the elbow. Instead, discover if the nerves are being pinched somewhere else. But the audience will never tell you that directly. They will simply tell you where the pain is, not the source of the pain. Editing decisions become particularly acute in the last days before the film is released, since changes made now will be permanent. If you, as the editor, have a particularly strong feeling about something at this stage, you should try to make your point as forcefully and convincingly as you can. Perhaps you stay late and do a test version of your idea, sketch something out. But you also need to have discretion, a sense of who you are dealing with, and present your ideas to the director or producer in the right context. And how you go about this has to do with your whole working history, how you were hired, how much you respect the director, how much the director respects you. I remember one moment particularly, after the filming of Julia, when Fred Zinnemann and I were debating what final changes to make in the structure of the beginning, which seemed to have been difficult for the audience to follow. The opening reel of the film had a nested sequence of flashbacks, memory of a memory of a memory of a memory, and it was perhaps one too many. I suggested eliminating one scene that occupied a unique time frame in the film's structure, one that was never reprised. And we decided to remove this, since it meant that the scenes that were left would consequently sort themselves into a more graspable sequence. As I was undoing the splices, and they made a little screech as they came apart, almost as if they were crying out in pain, Zinnemann looked thoughtfully at what was happening and observed in an almost offhand way, "You know, when I first read this scene in the script, I knew I could do this film." I hesitated briefly, looked at him, and then continued undoing the splices. But my heart was in my throat, because at that stage in the process, you do not know. You can only have faith that what you are doing is the right thing. Were we mistakenly cutting out the heart of the film, or were we snipping off the umbilical cord? In retrospect, I believe it was the umbilical cord, that we were right to remove it. The scene did have an essential function at one point, which was to connect Fred Zinnemann to the project. But once that connection had been made, and Zinnemann's sensibility had flowed through that scene into all the other scenes in the film, it could finally be removed without any harm. But things like that do give you pause.